we're going to back up into in a wider lens perspective. I do want to discuss the idea of the holy order of the six-pointed star, and one of my I'll read out what I think playfully what they are. I don't want to stand by this, but it actually might be worth something. Anybody who wants to join the holy order has to commit to character, including moral character, including ethical behavior, just about everything I talk about in the practical wisdom work, inner life work, and inner life work involves the spiritual aspiration, the spiritual quest to know the soul and to know the divine. And number 3, the study of holy texts and holy ideas, integrating space and body. I'll talk about this tomorrow at greater length. Experiencing the holy through time, and of course in holy community. I want to take a step back and inspired by the question of, for example, what the term chukim means, to just give you a little bit of guidance on what it means to study sacred scripture. First of all, whenever the rabbis make a statement about the nature of language, there's almost always a deeper point being made. So I want to take this idea, according to the rabbis, that there are some mitzvot that don't make rational sense, and they pick the word chukim to describe that. Now, the reason I disagree with the idea mainly is because when you look at the word chok as used in the Torah, in many places it's used for something that is entirely rational, entirely reasonable. So assuming the rabbis knew the language of the Torah better than I do, why would they say such a thing? Why would they say there's a word that refers to laws that are not reasonable or rational, and then I can point out 20 uses that indicate the exact opposite? It's not because they don't know the language, because they're trying to communicate something else. So I try, when I study scripture and the rabbi studying scripture, and the rabbis say something that is falsifiable, this helps me try to understand what I call the rabbinic mind. So whenever you're studying the Bible, it's worthwhile studying the Bible as the Bible. It's profoundly deep and wise and stretching the soul. But whenever you read the Bible with the rabbis, meaning the Midrash and Talmud, you're reading the rabbinic mind. You're reading to their mind. So what was the quandary of the rabbis when the Jewish tradition really began to come together with the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Talmud, let's say from around the year 200 to 600? What was the context of this? Now, one of the contexts, of course, was Christianity. And one of the things that Christianity was working on was the struggle between reason and revelation. So you look at some of the early church fathers and the relationship between Hellenism and Christianity, and will mean a religion of revelation, Christianity, of course, being a daughter religion of Judaism, and the path of reason. So I want us to think about this. There's one path, we'll call it the path of reason, that tells us that there is a path not unlike the physical sciences, which is knowing truth by observation, physical, natural science, etc. There's another path called reasoning, and I think we probably point to Aristotle as the greatest exponent of that will lead you to truth by a certain way of using the mind. And by the way, I agree with this. I think one of the problems in the world today, really in the world today, is that people are not rational, people don't reason. If people were rational and would reason, we wouldn't find what's going on in the college campuses. I mean, whatever they're learning, they're not learning how to be rational and they're not learning how to reason. They're learning something else, which is very bad, because they actually could be learning about moral character and rationality and reasoning and truly understand what's happening in the world. We're not going to go down that road tonight, but I truly believe that the study of moral character, the study of rationality, and the study of reasoning is a core part of study for our development as human beings and for the fabric of our society here in the United States, and I think any society. But then there's another area that people study, and just by coincidence, because I'm interested in the next iteration of Or HaTorah, not just being wisdom. Meirav and I are expanding it beyond that, but the study of religion, and by religion, of course, Judaism, and our weekly Shabbat services and holidays, but also studying the wisdom of other religions at the same time. So I've been serendipitously studying Aquinas. I have this book on Aquinas on nature and grace. And Aquinas addresses this directly. He says there is a science called the science of, I'll translate loosely, the science of the holy. And when you're studying the science of the holy, it actually does proceed like the empirical, physical, natural sciences, and like the philosophic sciences, but in a different world. And that world takes for granted the foundation of the holy. So try to imagine the foundation of the physical and natural sciences. There's something called the empirical world. Okay, I agree. Then there's something called in philosophy called reason and rationality. And reason and rationality, you say can be measured. You can say, well, that's not reasonable. That's not rational. I think we can agree that like the natural physical sciences, something that can be measured by another reasonable, rational person. And contrary to the postmodernists, I think you really can do that. But let's say a person who's committed to either the natural sciences, the physical sciences, the philosophical sciences, has no sense of the holy, has no sense of the transcendent. Now, this is where Aquinas comes in and says the science of the holy, or he calls it revelation, but I'm going to move at a wider perspective. I'm going to say the holy. Once one takes the reality of the holy as a starting point, it's a whole different way of knowing. And that's why you have some of the church fathers saying something like this, that faith is a way of knowing. Now, many people think, well, it's the opposite, isn't it? That there's knowing through reason, which is real knowing, and faith is a way of not knowing, accepting things on so-called blind faith. Well, that's not what Christianity teaches as far as I know, and certainly not what Judaism teaches. There's no blindness in faith. In fact, if we call faith something like being faithful to something that one has seen or known, meaning not the idea of faith as some kind of dogmatic attention to something that can't be falsified, that's one meaning. But think of faith as being faithful to somebody, being faithful to an idea. Well, if you don't know what the idea is, if you've never studied it, how could you be faithful to it? So when you, for example, let's say you experience the holy. In whatever way you experience it and you know it, and a person who is a reasoning, rational person says, well, prove it to me. You say, I can't prove it because it's really a subjective experience of something real, like a dream, like pain. I can't show it to you, I can't demonstrate it to you, but I know I had a dream and I know it had these features. And I know enough about dreams to realize that it probably has meaning that percolated out of my subconscious inner life. Well, a reasoning person says, well, you can't prove any of that, so it doesn't exist. So let's say I have faith that there's something called the unconscious, the subconscious. It symbolizes into my asleep conscious, and I can recall it in the morning. Let's say I have faith that that's true. Then I will know that in a way that a person who wants me to prove it rationally will not understand it. So faith is a way of knowing in that a person of faith has experienced something that reasoning can't take you toward, but once you experience it, you want to reason about it. You want to think about it. You want to figure out what Aquinas would call a science, meaning an ordered way of knowing about something. Now, why does the word chukim come then? Why do the rabbis invent this idea that chukim refers to things that are not demonstratable? Because like the Christians, there were people that said, I don't understand it, you can't prove it to me, therefore it doesn't exist. Now, what if you had experienced the holy? You read a Jan Richardson poem, you had a transcendent experience, you experienced the holy, and someone said, that's not true, there's nothing called the holy, there's nothing called transcendent. You'd have to say something like, you're going to have to take my word for it if we want to continue this discussion. You're just going to have to believe me that there's some things you just don't understand that I base my life on. And if you want to join this conversation, you're going to have to take it on faith, meaning I can't prove it to you. I can't reason it to you. Something like something that one must accept on faith, even though you don't understand it. That doesn't mean the person who has experienced the holy doesn't understand it. It means that you don't yet understand it, not because they have blind faith, I would say because they've been enlightened. Enlightened is the opposite of blind. So let's say a person who has been enlightened by knowledge of the holy, trying to talk to a person who has no experience of the holy, and you say, if you want to join the holy order, you'll have to take it on faith, which means faith in the rest of us who have experienced it. So in the early church, they began to say there are things that we can't demonstrate to you, we can't prove it to you, we can't reason you toward it. You'll have to take it on faith. Then people invented the term blind faith. So the rabbis, who are working with the exact same thing, by the way, they used a word in the Bible, chok, to refer to things that are not provable and not demonstratable. Now, it's not, in my mind, illicit use because there are so many words called chok that are eminently demonstratable. So why would the rabbis do that? They needed a word to say to people, your rational mind can't comprehend everything. Well, that's true. But what about a mind that has been touched by the holy? That's where Maimonides comes in. Maimonides says, there are no commandments that are not understandable. Every commandment is understandable if you knew enough. So he doesn't agree with the idea that God gives chukim so we can be loyal, which is one of the ideas. Why would God give us something not understandable so you can prove your loyalty? That's actually kind of abhorrent to me, that God would say things for me to do that I can't understand just to test my loyalty. I really don't like that because I really need to understand things. So Maimonides rejects that entirely. He says all mitzvot have what are called ta'amim. A ta'am means a taste, but also means a reason. Ta'amei mitzvot means the reasons for the commandments. There's two schools of thought. One school of thought says not every commandment has a reason, a ta'am. There's another school of thought that says every mitzvah has a ta'am or a reason. It's a big machloket. There's a big divide here. Now, I'm on the side with Maimonides and others that says every mitzvah has a ta'am, a reason, if we knew enough. Now, I just want to say one little diversion here. One reason we understand the commandments so much better today than they did in the first century is because we have the advantages of, for example, anthropology, the study of culture. For example, in the not mixing, someone would say, well, that's just a chok. We don't understand that. When you do anthropological studies of societies that are very focused on separating things, of purity, not mixing things. By the way, Mary Douglas would be a great person to read. She has a wonderful book called Purity and Danger. Purity and Danger, you should all read it. And she says, cultures that feel squeezed in on the outside tend to develop strict laws of purity because the chaos of the outside world has them create order on the inside world. Now, if you take that too far, that can be obsessiveness, and in an individual human being, it can be a neurosis. But just think about it. When your world's falling apart, many people either fall apart or create inner order. So when someone says, well, we don't understand why you can't mix linen and wool, it's not understandable. Of course it's understandable if you understand that cultures under pressure and people under pressure tend to want to divide the world up in a very orderly way. And when they're somewhat not under pressure, some of these standards are relaxed. So I just want you to think about it. Oftentimes when people, I remember when, I'm a vegan for heart conditions, but I remember when veganism first became a thing, wow, it was like a religion. If you tried to say, well, I'm not this, they said, and they would have, it was like an almost evangelical fervor, that the stores had to label it, and if they didn't, they could get a fine. And what the word organic means, for me, it became a bit obsessive, a bit scary. And when I would talk to people, it reminded me of a person who had, now, this is only anecdotal, but it's such inner distress. They needed to create order in the world and make everybody else agree with their order. Okay? Now, that's the power of these ideas of religion. So what I want to share with you, if part of the holy Israelite order is, number one, moral character, including being an ethical person, not causing harm to others. If it includes things like wisdom, reasoning, and depth. And I think for any sacred community, there really does have to be a text. We have to refer to something that has symbolic power in our lives, that we can refer to in our common lives as human beings. So I think to have a community of holiness, we have to refer to shared rituals, myths, symbols, sacred stories, and we have to have ways to interpret our sacred stories. And one way we learn to interpret sacred stories is to learn how to study Scripture. So this long response to the idea of chok is my understanding of why the rabbis came up with a term that I think is, from a linguistic perspective, indefensible. There must have been something other going on. And what they're trying to say is, for people who depend on natural empirical sciences and philosophic sciences, there's something they don't know. There's something they don't know. And if they want to join the Holy Order, they have to take it on faith until they know it. Now, I want to just share with you, I would, back in the days when we had our live services, people would come, they'd hold the prayer book and they'd say, I don't get it. I don't like this davening. I don't like being scripted. It means nothing to me. I don't understand. Look, you're a smart man, Rabbi Finley. You seem to be kind of a rational guy. I don't understand how this is meaningful to you. I can't get it. And I say, will you trust me that there's something to get? Will you trust me that there's deep spiritual and mystical and poetic depth in the book that you're holding, even though you can't see it? Now try to imagine that moment. The person who all their lives said, I don't get the prayer book, I don't like being scripted, these prayers mean nothing, it's just rattled off so fast, I can't believe that anybody gets anything out of it. Okay, I've heard that only 10,000 times. And then someone says, actually, it's deep, it's poetry, it's transcendent, it's mystical. Now that person has a choice to make. Is there something they don't understand that someone says, you just don't understand it now, practice it anyway, let's see what happens later. Not because they'll never understand it. The idea of not understandability is a holding place to make sure they don't reject it until they can understand it. So just to take the analogy further, because I believe that in any holy order, there has to be something of a spiritual practice, which includes engaging with our tefillah tradition. What would happen to a person? They would say, okay, all right. They would say, okay, I'm going to take it on faith. I don't understand it. I don't think it is understandable, but I believe you. What should I do? Many of you have heard me say to people this: meditate on the word atah, you, and imagine you're saying you to the God you don't believe in, to the heart of the universe, but with all of you. Meaning you're going to reach down into the depths of you, maybe even depths you haven't even considered before, all the way down into the depths of the inner life that I call the soul, and you're going to bring it all forward. And sometimes it takes a week just to be able to bring forward the depth of your inner life, so there is an I, the fullness of I encountering a you. By the way, this is not Martin Buber's I you. Martin Buber's I you is more interpersonal. He really doesn't talk much about I you with the divine. I'm not saying that he's not implying it, but he doesn't. The I you with the divine is much more of a, in my mind, a mystical, Kabbalistic, Hasidic idea. And then I would say to a person, because I want to onboard them into the holy order of the six-pointed star, including sacred practice, including engaging with our deep poetic prayer tradition. Then I would say, now imagine, even if you don't believe in it, imagine there's a conscious soul of the universe that is present to you to the degree that you are present to it. Just imagine it. There's a conscious soul of the universe that is present to you to the degree that you are present to it. So it's going to depend on you. When people say, well, why doesn't God do one thing or another? I'll say, well, you got to be present. If you want God to be present, you have to be present to God. I believe that to be true. So now a person says, I take it on faith. It's a chok. I don't understand it. I don't know if it's real, but I believe you. And a person meditates on saying you to the divine, and they bring up their I after a lot of hard work. And then they have the fullness of their I, and they cultivate the experience of the divine you, and then it happens. And then it happens. Now, how do you know when it happens? Sorry. People break out in tears. They just break out in tears. There's a deep emotional release. I finally know it. I finally see it. It knows me. I know it. It's a transformational moment when the fullness of your I meets the fullness of the divine you. When you just say the word ata, because if I'm going to say you, there has to be an I saying it. And try to imagine the almost infinite depth of those two terms. And that's just one word of the prayer book. And maybe for some people, I might include myself here, it's the only word I need. I mean, if I had a prayer book that just had the word you printed 5,000 times, it might work for me. There's a lot of other words, and I've developed the poetics of many of them. So when I think of this holy order of the six-pointed star, what it means to join a holy order, one of our dimensions of this is the power of language to mediate between the conscious and the unconscious world. And if we're going to study our Siddur, our prayer book, and our sacred scripture, we got to know something about it. And unaided by teaching and teachers, either written or oral, as you have now, you probably won't be able to do it on your own because there's so much shaping that you need. So, for example, when I began to encounter the prayer book, I didn't know a lot of Hasidus. I don't think I knew any Hasidus, but I knew theory of language. By the way, I was talking to a colleague recently, and he said to me, what's the most important thing a rabbi can master before they really engage in rabbinic study? And I said, a theory of language. Because language mediates between the conscious and the unconscious. So they can know Bible, they can know Talmud, they can know Midrash, they can know all of this. But they don't understand how language mediates between the conscious and the unconscious. And you have that conceptual framework. And then you study the text. And you know your own soul. Something happens that's experientially transcendent. The Rudolf Otto's notion of das Heilige, the holy, becomes so apparent to you. So I want to further cultivate this idea of what it means when it says, Kadoshim Tehiyu, you shall be holy. And in my imagination, God says, so set up a holy order and make sure this holy order has some kind of orderliness to it. And we say, okay, six-pointed star, it's a place to start. What would be the 6 points on the star that anybody who comes into the holy order, that they have to have some kind of expertise about? This seems reasonable. You know, it's not 20, it's not just one. That's a nice number. It's a nice image. And because it's a nice number, it's a nice image, then I had to force myself to say, if I were actually going to found a holy order of the six-pointed star, which means there's 6 spiritual disciplines that are integrated into one thing that I can't articulate, but there are 6 spiritual disciplines, what would they be? And the careful spiritual study of Scripture would certainly be one of them. If you're not willing to study our sacred text in a thoughtful, somewhat rule-bound way with the goal of spiritual depth, this might not be the holy order for you. There might be a different holy order. Now, just the last word. How do I know that this path is so powerful? Because of poetry. If a person says, well, I don't want to join a religion, but I want to study sacred scripture, then I would say, then you have to have a canon of poetry that when you have your own little pamphlet of your 50 favorite poems, you read them and you experience joy, transcendence, sorrow, grief, knowledge, some kind of text you refer to that takes you on the spiritual path. All right, that's my message for tonight on the 6 points of the holy order. The one point being the holy practice of the study of Scripture, which requires that we understand how the Bible works, and if we want to study rabbinic thoughts, we have to understand how the rabbinic mind works as well.